This video was brought to you by the awesome educational website, The Great Courses Plus. Stay tuned to hear about a special offer to keep the learning going. So the other day I was watching a video by my YouTuber pal Alec Bostwick, the clever mind behind the excellent Bostwiki channel. Specifically, I was watching his video about power, which explains his theory for what it takes to get to the top of life's various pyramids.
The best way to acquire power is to imagine it like a hierarchical triangle. In any domain, we have a lot of people at the bottom, some people in the middle, and a complicated maze inside the triangle that leads to one person at the top, who the triangle has granted the muscle to influence everyone below them.
Help me.
Oh, shut up. The triangle can be a government, a film studio like Disney, or even a tech company like Apple. Either way, power is a triangle.
And watching this reminded me of a book I read that was very influential to me when I was a younger man. This book here, King of the Mountain, by Dr. Arnold M. Ludwig, a professor of psychiatry from the University of Kentucky, published in 2002. Dr. Ludwig sought to investigate not only how people got to the top of the triangle of power, but also why some people were so much better at using that power once they got there. His goal was to come up with a single unified theory of political greatness by studying all of the world leaders of the 20th century and observing what separated the successful ones from the failures. And yes, that's right, I said all of the world leaders. It was really quite an astonishingly ambitious project.
How did you go about your research on this, and how long did it take you?
I looked at every possible source I could. I looked at every bit of biographical information. I looked at, I think along the way, I read over 1,200 biographies.
Over what time?
Over about an 18-year span. I believe that this is the most comprehensive, complete study on human rulers that's ever been done.
So Dr. Ludwig concluded that in the years from 1900 to 1999, there had been about 1,941 heads of state across 199 countries. And in order to separate the successful ones from the failures, he gave them all a score from 1 to 37, according to his political greatness scale. And what does greatness in this sense mean?
By greatness, I mean nothing about how you feel toward do you admire this person? I mean, some of these people are despicable. They're horrible people. However, their achievements, political achievements, are monumental.
So in other words, Lenin would rank as a greater leader than Jimmy Carter, not because Lenin did better things for mankind or was a better person, but simply because Lenin, the man who seized control of the Russian government and founded the Soviet Union, accomplished bigger things with the power he obtained. He's thus the guy more likely to be remembered 200 years from now as a great man of history in the academic sense. Great leaders of this sort generally do things like win wars or revolutions, make their country richer, expand its borders, introduce a new constitution or ideology, and be an important figure in global affairs. Poor leaders, by contrast, generally preside over a regime defined by failure, defeat, or irrelevance. Length of rule and the size of country you rule obviously plays a big role in your greatness as well. Any full-term president of the United States will, by definition, always be a greater leader than an acting prime minister of Jamaica. So, just for reference, here are the men that Ludwig determined to be the top 10 greatest leaders of the 20th century. I will list them in no particular order, just because he says that there is obviously a fair bit of subjectivity when it comes to giving people a precise rank. But out of 1,941 leaders, these guys quite objectively did the most with the power they had. Mao Zedong and Deng Xiaoping of China, Lenin and Stalin of Russia, Franklin Roosevelt of America, General de Gaulle of France, General Suharto of Indonesia, General Ataturk of Turkey, Ho Chi Minh of Vietnam, and Marshal Tito of Yugoslavia. And you can probably predict how the rest of the list goes from there. Basically, the presidents and dictators and kings who achieved a lot in a lasting long-term way are in the elite tier, with the broadly competent but mostly mediocre leaders in the second tier, and the completely irrelevant or forgettable do-nothings like our old pal Kim Campbell of Canada at rock bottom. And again, this is not a moral judgment, but just a judgment of the magnitude of their accomplishments. Okay, now here is where things start to get interesting. Dr. Ludwig is a psychiatrist by training, and after reading all of these biographies, he tried to reach conclusions about the nature of power and what sort of people are destined to be good at using it. And what he came up with was a psychological profile that he dubbed the 7 pillars of political greatness. I've always been very intrigued by this profile, in part because it is not very flattering. A lot of us think of power at this level as something inherently desirable and like the ultimate measure of human achievement. Just think of how much we continue to fetishize founding fathers or other heroic rulers. And of course, there are no shortage of self-help books out there that present becoming an effective leader as something that grows out of inherently positive virtues like wise ideas and clear communication. But Ludwig says no, the 7 pillars of political greatness are actually somewhat more neutral in nature, and at times even unattractive. And they may be more deeply ingrained psychological dispositions as opposed to skills that just anyone can necessarily learn. As Dr. Ludwig writes, despite certain similarities in their backgrounds, educations, and personal characteristics, the great and the not great turn out to be basically different kinds of people in certain important respects, and that the actual ways that they differ have a powerful bearing on what they eventually will or won't accomplish during their reigns. Simply put, those who possess more of these pillars of greatness tend to accomplish more during their reigns than those who possess fewer. Before I get into each of the 7 pillars, I also want to note that Ludwig emphasizes this idea that even though his study is on politics, a lot of these traits can be found in great leaders in any field of human achievement. Indeed, as we shall see, government power is rarely the only sort of power a successful head of state will successfully exercise during his life. So as I run through this list, I want you to be thinking not only about successful political leaders, but also leaders of other organizations, maybe even the leader of a place where you once worked, or some sort of club you were a member of, or some sort of other large creative project you were part of. Pillar 1. Dominance. In one of the more controversial arguments of his book, Ludwig repeatedly claims that seeking power at the highest level is actually just a kind of outgrowth of a more primal evolutionary desire that a lot of men have, and yes, it is mostly men, to dominate other men in a sort of ape-like way. The desire to be the so-called alpha male of your pack of chimpanzees. But even if you don't accept that animalistic framing, the larger argument is that the most successful leaders are men uniquely obsessed with always being the top dog in whatever group they happen to be a part of at any given time. They boss around their siblings, they boss around their friends at school. If they're part of a club, they not only want to be club president, but rewrite all of the club rules as well. Or maybe they'll just make up their own new and better club altogether.
I'm gonna go build my own theme park with blackjack and hookers. In fact, forget the park!
Bossiness at this level can obviously be quite unattractive, but on the other hand, there are a lot of people in this life who are quite passive and will naturally defer to anybody who seems to want it more. When someone really wants to be in charge, after a while, it is easy to assume that they should be. Pillar 2. Contrariness. So one thing that grows out of a tendency to dominate others is a lack of respect for existing authority. Successful leaders thus often have a track record of rebelling against anyone who's currently in charge, from parents and teachers to the national government. This makes betrayal and backstabbing a popular habit, even activities that could be described as light treason. At a more personal level, a contrary disregard for the powers that be also means that successful leaders often don't have much interest in conforming to social norms, so they may be irreligious or have weird and eccentric religious views, for instance, or, even more commonly, reject standard views of sexual morality. Number 3, personal presence. This one is a bit more cliched. Basically, a successful leader will have some degree of charisma. This is why people put up with being bossed around by them. Their charm and passion makes them seem like the sort of person who is worth being bossed around by. Number 4, being a change agent. Leadership is not simply a matter of personality, of course. You actually have to be able to get some substantial things done, or you will just seem like a rude blowhard. Accordingly, great leaders often pursue very ambitious, risky, or even dangerous projects, like going to war against an enemy or adopting a brand new system of government that requires a lot of upfront sacrifice from everyone involved, but also has the potential to bring about great rewards in the long term. And how do leaders get these sorts of projects done? Well, if we look at that list of the top 10 leaders again, you can see that dictatorship, or at least a highly centralized autocratic style of rule, seems to be a popular choice. Democracy is slow and messy, and bureaucracy just gets in the way. So whenever possible, rule by decree. Number 5, vanity. This one is quite similar to the idea of personal presence. It's basically the idea of believing your own hype and tooting your own horn. If you sincerely believe that you are this great guy who everyone should follow and admire, and you constantly go out of your way to tell everyone around you how great you are and slap your name and picture everywhere, at some point, it starts to stick. Number 6, courage. So we've talked a lot about broadly unattractive qualities, but here is another positive one. Respect and trust is often earned when a leader is willing to actually put all of his rebellious and self-aggrandizing instincts into action and take a genuine personal risk in pursuing what he believes. There is a long history of great leaders spending time in prison for fighting for what they believe in, often literally fighting with violence and weapons. And of course, a lot of great leaders are also military veterans of some form or another, since we often interpret a willingness to fight in the army as a sign that you are brave enough to fight for other things as well. And lastly, pillar number 7, wary unease. This one comes up a lot whenever we talk about why some people get radicalized into terrorist groups and things, but it also explains why some people get radicalized into climbing to the top of the pyramid and consolidating power in a very extreme or dramatic fashion. There is a certain sort of person who just feels very alienated from society in some deep personal way, and is inclined towards dreams of rebellion or grandiosity as a cure. Often this is a symptom of undiagnosed mental illness, particularly depression, and even gaining all the power in the world will rarely cure it, but certainly a lot can get accomplished along the way. So I first read this book shortly after it was published in the early 2000s, and although I still think that a lot of the theories on the nature of power and leadership it puts forward are broadly correct and timeless, as the decades go on, I do increasingly wonder if maybe some of what Dr. Ludwig was describing was a very specifically 20th century phenomenon. The 20th century is often said to be the bloodiest in human history, with much of that bloodletting coming as the result of a string of successive ideological dictatorships and wars. In this book, The Great Big Book of Horrible Things by Matthew White, which is another personal favorite of mine, the author puts forward a theory of understanding the bloodiest years of the 20th century as a single continuous event that he calls the hemoclysm, or blood flood, which began with the decline of the Ottoman Empire in the 1910s and ended with the death of Mao Zedong in 1967. In between these two events was a sequence of radical regimes that arose in a kind of complicated chain reaction that would ultimately kill 150 million people. Though he doesn't use the term, Dr. Ludwig speaks of his research as being at least partially motivated by a desire to prevent another hemoclysm by warning his readers about the potential dangers of letting alpha male leaders reign without any reins on their power. And I wonder if that is a lesson that humanity has actually more or less learned. I think you definitely see a much broader type of people, significantly, not just men, in charge of things these days, and perhaps a bit more wariness and resistance to people who display some of the 7 pillar traits. That might mean we have fewer great leaders who do epic things out of bravery and rebellion, but also fewer leaders who plunge us into disasters out of a misguided effort to get themselves into the history books or cure their inner pain. And by the way, if you want to learn more about some of the great men of the 20th century, why not give today's video sponsor, The Great Courses Plus, a try? The Great Courses Plus is one of the best educational websites out there, offering thousands of hours of recorded video lectures from some of the world's top experts on a whole range of fields. For example, they have a whole string of lectures on the reign of noted great man of history Mao Zedong, delivered by the late Dr. Richard Baum, a man who was one of America's leading China scholars for many decades.
An obviously exuberant Chairman Mao revised his goal of catching up with Great Britain from 15 years down to only 3.
Or how about an epic 24 lecture series on the life and career of Sir Winston Churchill, delivered by Dr. Michael Sheldon, author of the acclaimed Churchill biography, Young Titan. As someone who's been using this site for quite a while now, I must say that there is really no substitute for an old-fashioned academic lecture when you really want to learn something. And the Great Courses Plus really goes out of their way to curate a premium selection of some of the best lectures out there. And you can check out everything that the Great Courses Plus has to offer by using the free trial link in the thing below. So I guess my closing question would be, do you think that the style of leadership that Dr. Ludwig and his 7 pillars describes is still common in the 21st century? Do you think there are any people holding power today, either in government or elsewhere, who seem destined to become great leaders of the sort we saw in the previous century? Or is society more skeptical and aware of the risks of putting these sorts of people in charge, even if that means making some trade-offs as well? Let me know in the comments. Like this video if you enjoyed it. Subscribe if you haven't already. Don't forget to give the Great Courses Plus a try, and I will see you all next week.